Authorized funding for the federal government runs out in 10 days. How will both parties move forward in the wake of the president's immigration moves? This is Special Report. Good evening, I'm Brett Baer. A Congress reviled by the public as fractured and do nothing will try to come together to get a lot of things done before the clock runs out in less than 2 weeks. And the dissension on Capitol Hill is amplified by President Obama's go-it-alone action on immigration, the environment, and other issues. We begin tonight with Chief Congressional Correspondent Mike Emanuel on Capitol Hill.
With the calendar now on December and the government due to run out of funding late night on the 11th, Congress returns with a sense of urgency on an extension. Both Democrats and Republicans say substantial progress was made on an omnibus package to operate the government through next September, and some establishment Republicans favor providing certainty.
I don't think it's good for the Congress, it's good for the Republican Party, or good for the people for us to be bogged down in an endless budget debate between now and the end of the year and then into next year. Some
conservatives favor passing a continuing resolution until February, which would avoid a government shutdown and allow the new GOP-led Congress to address funding. Maryland Democrat Congressman Chris Van Hollen says that's not the way to run government.
That creates too much instability and uncertainty in the economy, and that's a bad deal for the American public. My goodness, I mean, if we can't get together and come up with a funding bill that prioritizes government spending through the end of September, we should all pack it in.
Georgia Republican Congressman Tom Price has a proposal to fund most of the government through next September, but only pay for immigration-related programs for a few months, which North Carolina Republican Mark Meadows says makes a lot of sense.
For us to do something that's short-term that allows us to either address it in a reasonable way during the lame duck or address it again in January or February of next year is really what the American people are looking for.
Bipartisan lawmakers were close to a deal on a $440 billion package over 10 years on so-called tax extenders to avoid 55 retroactive tax hikes on businesses and individuals. But President Obama issued a veto threat.
The president has been very clear that he believes that our economic policies need to be focused on what we can do to benefit middle-class families and those who are trying to get into the middle class, because our economy grows best when it's growing from the middle out.
Some House Republicans say in this case they're behind Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid.
It's really sad because this has a consequence on jobs in our country, and this is lightning's going to strike. I support Senator Reid's efforts to come to a conclusion on the tax extenders.
Today, Reid urged his colleagues to get the critical work on those tax cuts funding the government and a military spending and defense policy measure done.
We may have to be here the week before Christmas and hopefully, Mr. President, not into the Christmas holiday.
As for the tax deal, I'm told the extension is expected to be a one-year extension, a compromise to give a new Congress time to potentially do tax reform and hopefully permanently clean up the code. Brett?
Mike Emanuel live on the Hill. Mike, thank you. We continue our coverage of immigration tonight with a look at just how much the president's new plan will cost you and your family. Correspondent William Elachianess does the math tonight from Los Angeles.
You can come out of the shadows and get right with the law.
Net gain or drain? The president's executive action on immigration set off not just a political debate, but an economic one as well.
These are very strong net positives for the economy, particularly on the fiscal side. Immigrants continue to pay heavily on the tax side and are the lowest users of government services.
Somebody has to pick up the tab, and that somebody are America's legal residents.
The conservative think tank Heritage Foundation estimates the president's action could cost taxpayers $40 billion a year, based in part on demographics. 50% of illegal immigrants here have less than a high school diploma. 31% live below the poverty line. 51% do not speak English well or at all. 35% are unemployed or not in the labor force.
Just as anybody who with an average 10th grade education will probably not be a high earner and will end up paying less in taxes than they receive in government services and benefits.
Benefits like education, though Americans already pay for that. Heritage also includes food stamps, housing, and welfare. Benefits the White House insists the immigrants do not qualify for, at least yet. but lawful presence does entitle them to Social Security, retirement, disability, and Medicare. And with a work permit, advocates say the immigrants will earn more, spend more, and pay more in taxes.
We see that on a total of about $350 billion of economic activity would basically be taken out of the shadows and be essentially legalized. In terms of wage increases, we're anticipating about $12 billion a year.
The White House now says the workers will qualify for the Earned Income Tax Credit. That's a check from the federal government worth thousands annually. A few years ago, the Inspector General said the feds paid illegal aliens $4 billion a year in tax credits they were not, at the time, entitled.
Now, the White House insists these immigrants do not qualify for Obamacare subsidies. But last week, the Health and Human Services Secretary encouraged families to apply. In her words, quote, "No questions will be asked, and it is not about immigration," unquote. Brett?
William, thank you. President Obama is said to be considering executive action to force employers to pay their workers more overtime. The Washington Examiner reports the administration would raise the minimum amount a worker must earn before he or she can be listed as exempt from overtime. That figure is currently $23,000. Labor rights attorneys say employers often abuse the exemption, but critics cite higher labor costs as a downside. While the rioting in Ferguson, Missouri is apparently over, at least for now, President Obama is keeping the subject alive, and critics say continuing to politicize the matter. Here is White House correspondent Wendell Goller.
Particularly young people.
The president met with cabinet members, civil rights activists, police, and elected officials, though none from Ferguson, Missouri, and community and faith leaders, focusing on a problem he said is not unique to Ferguson or to our times.
A simmering distrust that exists between too many police departments and too many communities of color.
His aides released a report that recommends changes in the program providing surplus military gear to local police agencies. It doesn't criticize it, though Mr. Obama said in August, "We don't want to blur the lines between the military and police." Officials say the tactical equipment was useful in the aftermath of the Boston Marathon bombing, and 90% of what's provided is office supplies anyway. But the White House says the federal government does have responsibility in making the gear available.
It stands to reason that additional law enforcement agencies would benefit from additional training about the use of this equipment.
The report also recommends local officials have input on what's provided and after-action reports be made when the equipment is used. It recommends increased use of police body cameras, spending $260 million to lower the cost to state and local communities, something former New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani thinks is a good idea.
95% of these situations, the police officers turn out to be justified, and had this police officer had a body camera, we would not be having this discussion.
Giuliani says witness accounts vary and are sometimes unreliable. A spokesman said Mr. Obama has spent much of his political career trying to build trust between law enforcement and minority communities. But as protests spread across the country and even onto the St. Louis Rams football field, his critics accused him of failing.
This kind of imagery keeps people from asking, I think, directly, why have our lives not gotten better? Why is the condition of our communities not well?
The president instructed Attorney General Eric Holder to meet with community leaders across the country and told a task force to come up with concrete solutions. New York Mayor Bill de Blasio said there was a sense in the talks that the problem needs to be solved while Mr. Obama's in office. Brett?
Wendell Goller live on the North Lawn. Wendell, thank you. Let's get some thoughts now on the politics of this moment and looking forward. Senior political analyst Britt Hume joins us tonight. Good evening, Britt.
Hi, Brett. Just 2 years after President Obama's remarkable re-election in the midst of economic conditions that would have spelled almost certain defeat for any ordinary politician, his party now finds itself in a hole from which his recent actions may make it difficult to escape. Democrats point to their standing with minority groups and especially Hispanics as evidence their future prospects are bright. But Democrats have been losing ground with white working-class voters for years, and the process seems now to be accelerating. Blue-collar whites are about 36% of the electorate, nearly twice the size of the black and Latino vote combined. President Obama got 40% of the blue-collar white vote in 2008. That dropped 4 points in 2012, and his party got 2 points less than that in the recent midterms. So the first thing Mr. Obama does after the election is to grant legal status and work permits to millions of illegal immigrants. Then he and his attorney general wade deeply into the white-on-black police shooting in Ferguson, Missouri. The president has condemned the looting and arson that broke out when a grand jury declined to indict the policeman. But Mr. Obama has never said one word suggesting that the slain black teenager Michael Brown was in any way responsible for what happened to him. Nor has he shunned the race hustler Al Sharpton, who was in attendance at that White House meeting today, where, as you heard, the Ferguson Police Department was not represented. Brett?
Brett, are you surprised how close Al Sharpton is to this White House, and even publicly?
I really am, Brett, because Sharpton has a very checkered history. The famous Tawana Brawley case, which was a terrible miscarriage of justice against a prosecutor, at least he tried to make it such. He's a tax cheat. He's in arrears by huge sums on his taxes. And I think the guy's politically radioactive. And I just don't understand for the life of me why the president would link himself so closely with this guy, because I think in terms of white working class voters, for example, I can't imagine that doesn't hurt the president and his party with such voters.
For all that we hear about the demographic shift in 2016, going back to your first point, you're saying that this possibly refigures the whole math on that?
I think it more than offsets it. For example, you're talking about the black vote's about 12 to 14% of the electorate. The Hispanic vote is less than 10. You put them together, you're a little more than half of what the white working class vote is, the white blue collar vote, people with less than a college education. And what if you do a little multiplication, percentage points, you pick up a little of the Hispanics, they grow a little bit. You do strongly well with blacks. That gains you a certain number of votes. But you're gaining against a percentage of about 20% of the electorate, or a little bit more than that. You gain with the white working class vote, or lose with it, the damage is much greater because it's such a larger portion of the electorate. And that's what I think Democrats, strategists should be worried about. And these recent actions by the president seem to me are not going to appeal to white working class voters.
Okay, Brett, as always, thanks.
You bet.
Up next, should you be able to say pretty much anything you want on social media, including threatening someone, and still call it free speech? First, here's what some of our Fox affiliates across the country are covering tonight. Fox 28 in Columbus, Ohio, where students are mourning the apparent suicide death of Ohio State football player Costa Corageorge. His body was found in a dumpster Sunday, 4 days after he disappeared. He had sent his parents a text saying concussions had messed up his head. Fox 2 in Detroit with the big news that Girl Scout cookies are entering the 21st century. For the first time, the 112-year-old organization will allow online sales. The start date is expected to be December 12th, just in time for the holidays. And this is a live look at New Orleans from Fox 8, our affiliate down there. The big story there tonight is the only debate between candidates for the Senate seat from Louisiana prior to Saturday's runoff. Incumbent Democrat Mary Landrieu is currently trailing Republican Congressman Bill Cassidy in most polls by double digits. That's tonight's live look outside the Beltway from Special Report. We'll be right back.